A while ago I made a video on cross-country bikes versus trail bikes. This one will be similar, but it's tailored specifically for those of you who are looking at Giant and trying to decide between the Anthem cross-country bike and the Trance trail bike. Maybe your local bike shop carries Giant, maybe you like Maestro suspension, maybe you like the value that you get with Giant. Whatever your case may be, I'm going to try to help you decide which bike is best for your needs. A lot of people's first reaction is that the Anthem is for cross-country racers and the Trance is for the general mountain bike population who just likes riding trails. That's not necessarily the case, and I'm going to look at the similarities between the bikes and then really focus in on the differences and help you decide which one is going to be best for your riding style. So let's get started. The bikes that I'll be using for this video are the 2016 Giant Trance Advance 1, which is a carbon bike, Fox Components, XT, carbon wheels. Also the 2016 Anthem, this is a custom build. It's the aluminum frame with XT components, Fox suspension, and the Stans Valor wheels. Now both of these are 27.5-inch wheel bikes. However, this video should also be helpful for you if you're looking at the 29er version of the Anthem, which Giant still offers. Now both of these use the Maestro suspension. I won't go really heavily into Maestro, but I'll just say that Maestro does a really good job at being stiff when you need it to be. When you're cranking hard up a hill, trying to accelerate real fast, or just putting a lot of power into the pedals, it's going to be a firm suspension design, and it's going to loosen up really easily when you hit a bump. So it's a really compliant design. It also decouples braking forces from the suspension. In other words, what that means, when you grab the rear brake real hard, the suspension does not stiffen up, which is really important when you're going downhill, whether it's on a cross-country bike or a trail bike. You want the suspension to still move freely when you're hitting bumps, even when you're having to apply the brakes. Now, as far as the differences, this is where the video will have a little bit of overlap with my cross-country versus trail bike, but some of these points are important to mention when looking at these bikes. First of all, the stem length. On the Giant Trance, you're going to have a shorter stem. What that does is it allows your weight to be back a little bit more, because this bike is designed to go up the climbs without too much of a weight penalty or time penalty, but really have fun on the descents. So this bike is geared more towards descending than it is overall speed or climbing. So the stem is a little bit shorter, and on the Anthem, you're typically going to have a longer stem. Now yes, this is a custom build. However, if you buy a stock Anthem, you're still going to have a longer stem. The reason you want a longer stem on a cross-country bike like the Anthem is you want your weight more over the front of the bike. That gives you more traction when you're cornering on flatter trails. It also allows your weight to not be too far back when you're climbing, because if your weight is shifted back, it's going to get weight off the front wheel. It's going to allow the front wheel to wander around a little bit, which is going to be a little bit harder to control when you're going up a climb, because a cross-country bike is designed to climb pretty fast. So you can make up a lot of time on a cross-country bike, whereas you'd be a little bit slower on the trail bike, the Trance. The handlebar on the Trance is also going to be a little bit wider. That's going to give you more leverage over real technical stuff, especially when you're going downhill. You want to have a lot of control over the front end at higher speeds, because the Trance, as you're going to hear in a lot of these comparisons, is really designed to go fast downhill and be in a lot of control. So you are going to hit higher speeds typically on a Trance because you're hitting the descents harder. One of the big differences is the Trance is going to come with a dropper seat post. That allows the seat to go down when you're going on a descent and you want to get your center of gravity lower. That gives you a little bit more confidence when the trail gets rough. It also allows you to get your weight back. Once you use a dropper seat post, they're really addicting, and you really get used to getting that saddle down when you're going down a hill. On the Anthem, the stock Anthem will not come with the dropper seat post unless you get the SX. Now we'll talk about that at the end, because that's a good compromise between these two bikes and may be a good choice for some of you out there who are really having trouble deciding which one to get. With the Anthem, you don't want to pay that weight penalty to carry around a dropper seat post when you probably would only use it maybe 10% of the time. It is nice having one on a cross-country bike, but it's not as necessary as it is on the Trance. The Trance is also going to come with beefier tires. That's going to give you more traction and more stability in rough terrain. Whereas the tires on the Anthem have a little bit smaller knobs, that's going to allow them to roll faster because overall speed is very important on the cross-country bike on the Anthem. Today's Trance will come with 140 millimeters of travel on front and rear. Now again, there is the Trance SX, which has a little bit more travel up front, but for the regular Trance, you've got 140 front and rear. Whereas the Anthem is going to have 100 millimeters of travel in both the front and the rear. And the SX, by the way, has 120, and like I said, I'll mention that near the end of the video. Now, the reason that you want less travel on the Anthem is because you want this bike to be snappier. You want it to be a quicker, accelerating bike. Also, it allows for less material, and it allows the bike to be lighter. So, the lighter the bike, typically the faster the bike's going to be. Whereas again, on the Trance, you don't mind carrying around a little bit of extra weight for the descents. Now, this Trance does come with 34 millimeter stanchion forks. In other words, the stanchion tubes are thicker, and that allows for a stiffer front end. Whereas the Anthem will come with 32 millimeter stanchion forks, so a little bit thinner, it's lighter. Because the suspension travel is less, you don't get as much torque, as much flex in the fork, so you don't necessarily need a 34 millimeter stanchion fork because it's just going to add some extra weight. Of course, the longer suspension travel on the Trance is going to allow it to absorb bumps faster and harder hits. And the faster you go, the more suspension travel you need. So when you're going on a fast, rough descent, you really do need more travel. If you're on a bike like the Anthem and you're hitting stuff really hard, the suspension is going to ramp up really quickly, and it's going to not only have the bumps hit you harder and hit the bike harder, it's also going to buck you up a little bit more. So the Trance really absorbs trail chatter and bigger hits. So it allows you to have your body position be more constant, and again, allows you to go faster with more control. The differences in frame geometry are what really make these bikes handle differently. And I'll use the geometry as my segue into starting to talk about the ride qualities of these bikes. So on the Trance, you're going to have a steeper head angle. Now, what that does is on flatter trails, it actually makes the bike feel more sluggish, a little bit more heavy, take a little bit more effort to turn the bike because you're going slower. However, with the head angle slacker, it allows this bike to go on descents with more confidence and more stability. It also allows the bike to have more of a carving feel when you turn. So in other words, when you're on a flatter trail, the bike has more of an arc feel. It does take more real estate, more trail to get the bike around a corner with that slacker head angle. Whereas on the Anthem, the head angle is going to be steeper. So that allows the bike to more dive into a corner. You can start the corner quicker, and it also feels like you can change lines quicker. Whereas on the Trance, you feel like you're a little bit more committed to the line that you're taking. The advantage of that, though, is that the bike feels more stable in the corner. The Anthem is going to feel a little bit more twitchy, but again, it's going to feel like you can pop out of that corner and go into another one really quickly. Also on the Trance, the chain stays are just a little bit longer. They're about 17.2 inches, whereas on the Anthem, they're about 17. Shorter chain stays allow the bike to accelerate quicker. If the bike will feel a little bit more snappy, but longer chain stays allow for a little bit more stability, again, when you're going downhill. And let me mention something here about descending with the geometry. The Trance at, let's say, 25 miles an hour is going to handle fairly similarly to the way the Anthem is going to handle at 15 miles an hour. So the faster that you go on a trail bike like the Trance with the slacker geometry, the more advantage those different geometry numbers are going to have. So again, with this bike, It's designed to go fast downhill and still be stable. If you were going at the speeds you could carry on the Trance, if you were doing that on the Anthem, the bike's going to be a little bit twitchy. It's really going to take a lot of concentration to pick the right line, to keep the bike stable over the bumps when you're going downhill. Now, on a cross-country bike like this, it's designed for overall speed. So that's one of the sacrifices that you make when you're going downhill. Now, let me just mention that the Anthem is a full suspension bike. So even though it's a cross-country bike, it's going to be more capable than a hardtail on descents. So that's the nice thing for me about having a full suspension cross-country bike, is I don't make huge sacrifices in the descending capabilities and fun of this bike. I had mentioned a minute ago about the shorter stem causing your weight to be back and the front wheel to wander around a little bit on a climb. Also, with the longer suspension travel, the slacker head angle, it is going to take a little bit more concentration on the Trance when you're climbing to keep the front wheel steady. Now, the advantage of climbing on the Trance is that you do have more suspension travel, so if you're going up a really rough climb, you're actually going to have a little bit more traction with the Trance. Now, the Anthem, because it's lighter, is going to typically climb faster. So if the trails are not really rough and you don't need the suspension to absorb all kinds of roots and rocks on a climb, the Anthem is going to get up the climbs faster. So as I've mentioned several times, rough descents are where the Trance really shines, and that's why you put up with a more sluggish bike on flatter terrain, a heavier bike on the climbs, is so that you can really light up a descent. So the suspension travel, the dropper seat post, the shorter stem, the wider bars, the stable geometry allow you to carry a lot of speed on a downhill. And that is the purpose of the Trance, is to really have a bike that's capable on the flats, very capable on the climbs, but really have a blast on the descents. Whereas the Anthem is really designed for all-around speed. It's faster on the climbs typically. It's faster and snappier on the flatter terrain. And it does descend very well because it's full suspension, like I said, but it's not going to be as fast as the Trance when you're going down a hill. So now let's get to the bottom line of which bike is right for which type of rider. Obviously, if you're a cross-country racer, you're going to choose the Anthem. And by doing that, you're still going to have a very capable trail bike. The Anthem is a bike that's really balanced. In other words, it doesn't feel like the front end's real snappy and the rear end's dragging. Now this is the 27.5. The 29er Anthem, the rear end feels a little bit long and a little bit behind the snappiness of the front end. But for the 27.5 version, you've got a very snappy, quick handling bike, but it's also going to be capable on the descents. Very, very balanced in the way the suspension rides. When I got my Trance, I kind of had the thought that since it's a carbon frame with carbon wheels, it's going to be fairly light. And this bike, by the way, is about 28 pounds. My Anthem comes in around 23, maybe a hair under. I have it built up pretty light. So I had the idea that maybe I could just have the Trance as my cross-country bike. But after riding on my local trails, this bike does feel more sluggish on my trails. I actually, on my local trails, which are just rolling, they're flat in some areas, I have more fun on my Anthem because I like a lighter bike. I like a snappy bike on my typical trails. I have the Trance for going up in the mountains. So I rode with a guy a few weeks ago on my Trance. I was getting ready to go do a trip in the mountains, so I was spending time on my Trance, and he was on a cross-country bike. I had to work my butt off to keep up with him on my Trance. It was a huge amount of effort. So there is, as far as cross-country type speed, the Anthem is going to be a faster bike, hands down. Which that leads me into another point, is you've got to consider who you ride with. You ride with guys on cross-country bikes? Think you need to get an Anthem if you want to keep up with them. Do you ride with guys on trail bikes or enduro type bikes? Then you're probably going to want to have a Trance because you're going to want to keep up with them on the descents, and you don't want to just be miles ahead on the climbs and be waiting for them. So take a look at not only your local trails, but also the type of bikes that the people you ride most often with are riding. If you race enduro, the Trance is a really great option. In fact, the Giant Rain may be a good option if you race enduro. You really got to look at the type of courses that you typically race on, but the Anthem is probably not going to be the best choice for enduro racing unless the trails are just really smooth. So I talked about racing. Probably most of you watching this video are not racers, and you're trying to decide which one of these bikes is going to fit you best. If you live in a mountainous area and the descents are not buffed and typical mountain type riding, I would go for the Trance. In fact, if I lived up where I typically ride a lot, which is North Georgia and North Carolina, when I go on vacation, I always bring my Trance because I don't mind just going up the climbs at a nice steady pace and really having fun on the descents. I mean, that's why I go to the mountains, because I love going downhill. Now, to say that, I've talked a lot about the descending characteristics of the Trance. It's not all about going downhill. This is a very capable bike. If you just kind of travel around, you don't really know what type of terrain you're going to encounter, the Trance is a very versatile bike, and one that I would probably choose if I just went all over the place and had a variety of terrain, because the Trance is still a very capable bike on the flats. So when the trails are not that hilly, it's still a fun bike to ride. I still have a blast on my local trails. I like the way this bike corners. I also like when there's a lot of leaves on the trail and the fall. I like the bigger knob, so a lot of times I'll choose this Trance when I just need that extra traction. Now, if you live in an area that does not have a lot of climbing and descending, or the trails are a little bit smoother, I think you're going to have more fun on the Anthem because, like I said before, of how snappy it feels and how light it feels. Even though I don't race mountain bikes as much as I used to, most of my racing now is cyclocross, I still love riding fast. I like just pinning it sometimes as fast as I can go, whether it's a Strava segment, riding with buddies, or just out on my own. The Anthem just has that sports car type feel, or sport bike type feel. You just feel like you can go fast. It's still a bike that has a lot of control. With again, the full suspension allows you just to float over bumps that aren't really too massive, but still ride the bike with a lot of control and a lot of fun. In case you're curious about why I went with a carbon Trance and the aluminum Anthem, the reason is because I bought the Trance as a complete bike. I didn't really intend to get a carbon frame. I wanted carbon wheels. I knew that for sure after putting carbon wheels on my cross-country bike. So when it came time to buy the complete bike, the aluminum frame with the carbon wheels wasn't really that much difference in price between the carbon. So I figured, since I'm getting a complete bike, I might as well get the carbon, because you get a better value when you buy a complete bike as opposed to when you build one from the ground up. So that's why I went with the aluminum. I really wanted to put the money into the carbon wheels. This is a $2,000 wheel set. Excellent wheel set, very stiff, very light, very fun to ride. So I wanted to put the money there because I get a better ride quality with carbon wheels and aluminum frame than carbon frame and aluminum wheels. So I had a budget, I had to stick to it, and so that's why I went with the aluminum Giant Anthem. Now, even though this frame is aluminum, it's still very stiff. Giant makes great aluminum. They also make great carbon. And by the way, Giant does make carbon frames and aluminum frames for other bike manufacturers. So they make some of the best carbon in the business. They also make really great aluminum. So like I said, it's light, it's still stiff. This bike, like I said earlier, is a little under 23 pounds, so the wheels really help that. The lighter drivetrain. I actually do have an Ultegra cassette on this bike right now. I have a wider range XT cassette for riding in the mountains, but for my local trails, I like to lighten up the bike with this lighter Ultegra cassette. I want to talk about the Anthem SX real quick because, like I said earlier, that's a great option for some of you who are trying to decide between the trails. And the Anthem SX is basically a Giant Anthem with a 120 millimeter travel fork instead of the 100, and it has a dropper seat post. I think they also have a little bit beefier tires, so it really is a mix right between the Trance and the Anthem. If I had to choose one bike, that's probably what I would do. I did put a 120 millimeter fork on this bike. I prefer the 100 because my local trails are really tight and twisty, and the 100 gets me around the trails faster. And like I said, the 100 gives it a little bit more of a sport bike feel. The shorter travel in the front also puts your weight a little bit lower, lowering that center of gravity. Now, the advantage of the SX is also that you have a higher bottom bracket. This bike has a pretty low bottom bracket. The advantage is that it helps the cornering, helps get your center of gravity lower, but it does allow for more pedal strikes. So that's the advantage of a longer travel fork. But like I said, the SX is a really good option. If I had to just go down to one bike, that's probably what I would do. I'd probably have a longer travel fork on my Giant Anthem. But since I have both bikes, I stick with the 100 on the Anthem and of course the 140 on the Trance. So that's going to wrap it up. I hope I mentioned some points that are going to help you decide which bike you're going to choose. Like I said, not all of you are racers. The reason we mountain bike is to enjoy the outdoors and have fun. Both of these bikes are fun. Just because a bike has more suspension travel and a dropper seat post and bigger tires doesn't make it a more fun bike. It makes it more fun in the descents, but it doesn't necessarily make it an all-around more fun. I love the sports bike type feel that I get on my Anthem, like I said a few minutes ago. So the Anthem is still a super fun bike to ride, and it's also fun to hit climbs and get up them really quickly and not feel like the bike is weighing you down. So a lot of factors to consider. Do you race? Who do you ride with? What is fun for you? And mainly, what type of trails do you ride most often? Because that is the number one factor in determining which bike is right for you. So if you have any questions or comments for me, leave them below. Thanks for watching. And if you're wondering why I shot that video indoors, this is why. Major storm.